many of you ever remember being asked as a child, why are you crying? Yeah, I do. And you know what? I hated it. I mean, the implication always seemed to be, it's not worth your tears. So, you know what? Get a grip. Yet, I also have to confess, I have asked this very question of my own children. I did it when they were young with this very same assumption in mind. In fact, I might have even used some of those little sayings that parents have to belittle the emotions of childhood. Stuff like, don't cry over spilled milk. Y'all know that one, right? I think that maybe as adults, especially in this culture, we believe that crying, well, it should have a real purpose. You see, it's not thought of as something we just haul out when things, well, really aren't that bad, or so we say. And even when they are that bad, we are hard pressed to admit that it's okay for us to cry about it. You see, we think that we feel indulgent or apologetic, maybe even a little bit embarrassed or worried that, well, somehow we'll just make things worse. Well, I think this might be some of what we're seeing going on in Psalm 34 today. You see, on the surface, there's all this great imagery about trust and praise and happiness and rejoicing, expressing this kind of faith that has just never, ever failed them and never, ever will. But then I get stuck on those last few verses, and I'm wondering what's going on there. Because it says things like, he will keep safe all of his bones, not one of them shall be broken. And the Lord ransoms the life of his servants, and none of them will be punished who trust in him. I found myself asking the question, why are they so worried about stuff like broken bones and punishment? You see, it feels to me a little bit like they're afraid. They're afraid that ceasing all of those songs of praise for even one little second to express some sort of fear or grief in the face of suffering would somehow negate God's promises of goodness that had been made to them. Whoever penned this song, well, they sort of sound to me like they're struggling with the people's stubborn anxiety, possibly even present despair over a crisis either past, current, or looming on the horizon. They worry that all of this angst might be a betrayal of the people's faith, maybe even a denying of God. And that looks like it's something that the psalmist fears could have dire consequences. It feels a bit like one of those ancient don't cry over spilled milk moments, to me at least. For the people who first came to know God in these prayers and sang them together in worship, it's starting to look like faith might imply the sort of hope that includes sidestepping all the evidence to the contrary. It feels like a chin up, cheerio, and carry on kind of attitude, which might feel even a bit naive to us. But from the perspective of our psalmist, faith is a form of action. It's a matter of survival. You go to the temple, you offer your sacrifice, and then you go out and plant your seeds in the field for the season every year. To do otherwise would be apostasy as well as risking starvation. In our time, faith seems to have become a sort of existential state instead. Either you have it or you don't. Either you're a believer or you aren't. For many people, faith has come to imply and insist upon a sort of surety that leaves very little space for genuine worries and fears. It's like it needs to be this immutable state of mind, an expression of self and identity. I wonder if it's because we don't live in that subsistence agrarian world anymore. With modern seeds and fertilizers and irrigation systems, when we plant things in the ground, we pretty much expect them to grow. And when we don't, we can go to the grocery store. We pretty much expect the food to be right there on the shelves, along with toilet paper and all the other necessities of life, right? Now, I have lived in a place that plants and harvests without all of those benefits of industrial agriculture. Where I lived in Africa, they planted in the early springs in the fields of our village. And what they planted, it was the seeds, whatever was left over from the preceding year's harvest. That was it. That was all they had. They couldn't call out to Monsanto and say, send us another bag or two. Winter was dry and very cold, and the summer was when the rains came, along with the warmth from the sun. So exactly when to plant those precious few seeds was always this kind of iffy prospect. They needed to do it just when the rains were starting, because if they got it wrong and the rains were late, then the seeds would just die and wither in the ground. And if they waited too long, then the seeds would not mature before the rain stopped in the fall and the temperatures dropped, and they wouldn't have mature ears of corn. And what if the rains never came at all? You see, there was no backup. So if I think about it, planting really was a bold and risky act of faith, full of both hope and incredible anxiety. I mean, it's no wonder that every conversation started with, hello, how are you, how's your family, and then how's the weather? It was a huge topic of conversation. They discussed it, they cheered about it, they prayed about it, and they complained about it every day until harvest came in. Well, if we look at our first reading from Job, we can kind of see that same kind of pairing of desperation and celebration all going on in one passage. But what about that ending? Does it maybe feel like some sort of perverse assurance, a reward for some sort of unbridled, almost superhuman faith and hope, given everything that God has put Job through up to this point? If we take this passage in isolation, I think we're left with one of the ultimate don't cry over spilled milk moments. It's like just looking at these few paragraphs, it's saying something like submit to whatever God capriciously throws your way and you will be rewarded in the end. The problem is, I can't help thinking that all of the new family and prosperity in the world, it would not erase my own grief at losing my spouse and my children. It wouldn't eliminate my anger at God for putting me through something that awful. I mean, the tears, they might lessen over time, but every last one of them would be worth shedding, like this precious little memory of everything that I had lost. The book of Job, if you take it in its entirety, well, it's much more complex. It's this incredible, multifaceted look at how faith intersects with adversity. It covers the full spectrum of ways that our relationship with God can struggle and be strengthened. We allow ourselves to cry and argue and rail at God, if that is what we're feeling in the moment. Now, I sort of get this feeling the lectionary intends this final section to be a comforting one, focusing us on God giving Job this return to prosperity is a sort of implied promise to us all to help us get through hard things. But I need the whole book to work for me. I actually find more comfort in the rest of Job, which teases out that full range of emotions and experience of someone who is smack in the middle of chaos and disaster. I mean, anger, grief, blame, despair, it's all right there in the book of Job. It's all part of Job's journey of faith with God. This book, which is said to be a book of wisdom in Jewish tradition, well, it was not just there recalling all those past acts of salvation with this sense of security. Whoever wrote it down and whatever community it was that shaped it, well, they were busy wondering, what is going on, God? And their faith meant having this rich, ambivalent, probably lifelong, open and honest dialogue with God. But they were not embarrassed to preserve for all of posterity. Seen in this light, deep faith, well, it allows for and indeed it demands us calling out to God even when we are least likely to feel good about God. Faith includes all of our unsavory and uncertain feelings about God and the universe that God has plunked us in the middle of, not just all the fluffy and acceptable stuff. It may be that faith is more like a stormy relationship, something we've got good AV for today, a stormy relationship with bonds that stretching right out to the limits, and sometimes, well, may feel broken, more like that than some sort of rock solid state that just never shifts or moves with what's going on in our lives. See, if God can be in the midst of all of that too, then God really must be the God of mercy and compassion and powerful transformation that we meet in Scripture and in our lives. And isn't that the place where we most need the hope that God is holding out to us, even when we can't quite feel it? I wonder about Bartimaeus in this light. You see, throughout Christian history, Bartimaeus has been held up as this sort of hero of blind faith. He trusted to call out to Jesus, and his faith was rewarded. But I'm guessing it's a lot messier than that. The location here gives some of that away because it's set outside Jericho. Y'all remember what happened in Jericho? Stephen does. He told us at 8 o'clock. It's the place where God acted. God acted in the midst of a hopeless and violent war and demanded this kind of silly seeming but very faithful gesture from the people. March around the city, play your trumpets, and on the last day, turn around and shout at the city, and the walls will just fall down. I will never forget the Veggie Tales. I think it's the cute Larry the Cucumber turning through the walls and like, ah! It's a great story. Yet Jericho in Jesus' time is more than just a place of deep historical resonance. It's also seen as a notorious den of thieves and revolutionaries. It's kind of this place of danger and upheaval all kind of rolled into one. I mean, if you imagine for yourselves a photo straight out of your news feeds, a blind man sitting begging on the street surrounded by drug users and gang violence and political unrest, you would start to get a picture. It seems like chaos is the locus of God's grace. So I'm guessing that when Bartimaeus called out to Jesus and named him as that hoped-for Messiah, the son of David, that it was as much Bartimaeus wishing it to be so as any sort of sense of rock-solid knowing inside of him. I mean, I am sure that he had called out to others for help before and been disappointed. I'm guessing that he sort of expected to be shot down again. And in fact, if you listen to the crowd's first responses, he tried to squash everything that he was saying. But you know what? Jesus asked him, "What do you want? What do you want?" Now, I have to confess, it's a day of parenting confessions, I suppose. But I used to ask my kids this question all the time, only it wasn't because I really wanted to know. I mean, sometimes I did. Sometimes I really wanted to get down on my knees and talk to them. But a lot of the time, I was just asking this question because I kind of wanted them to go away. Because whatever I was doing was far more important than whatever it was that they needed in that moment. But you know what? Jesus genuinely wants to hear what Bartimaeus wants Jesus to do for him. And so Bartimaeus decides to go for broke. He's going to risk being foolish enough to lay bare his deepest and most impossible desire. Let me see again. Bartimaeus' faith that Jesus is somehow a source of God's healing, well, it could be the overwhelming kind of faith, or could be only that small little sliver of hope. I mean, we can't tell from the passage. But either way, it's an amazing request. Would we have the courage to ask Jesus for the thing that we truly want? To ask Jesus for the thing that feels almost impossible? I don't know if I would. But what we've learned today is that faith is an act of hope that dares to lay bare to the God of mercy all of that stuff, all the anxiety and the fear and the weeping and all of those audacious wants and needs. Faith is just barely being able to call out when all that surrounds us makes us seem like God will never, ever hear us. That God can't possibly be here at all. Faith is here when we can't even find a voice, and maybe all we can find are tears. Even when God help me erupts, it's almost more of a condemnation than any sort of genuine request. All of that is faith. I think that when Jesus tells Bartimaeus, "Your faith has made you well," he's not praising Bartimaeus or rewarding him, but simply saying, "Thank you for showing up anyway. Thank you for bothering to talk to me at all. Amidst all of that ambivalence and raw need and fear within you, thank you for at least recognizing that I'm here and I'm with you." Whatever state of faith we find ourselves in, God's mercy in Jesus, it's right there asking us, "What do you need me to do?" Now, that is good news. It's a good news of grace that is at work in the whole of our world and all of its chaos. I'm part of an interfaith spiritual journey group with a bunch of moms that I've been meeting together with since our kids were pretty much in elementary school. And I vividly remember a Friday when one of the Jewish members shared her family's Shabbat practice with us. She walked us through all the different steps and practices, and she told us that one of the things they do is they open this joyful, sacred time with God, as they always tear off a piece of the challah, and then they dip it in some salt. They do this to remember the tears of their ancestors every week. And they also, she said, do it to tell themselves, wherever there is sweetness and joy, there is also the saltiness of sadness. So, How can we have faith in God's compassion and love and mercy if we don't let our needs and our fears and our hurts show? How can we hope in God if we can't blame and rail and mourn and doubt God too? And how can we receive healing if we never honestly answer Jesus' question, what do you want? It's all wrapped up together in this risky, amazing journey of faith. Because I believe that not a single tear that we shed is seen as spilled milk to God. So you know what? Go ahead and let it all show.